I'm the Beard. And tonight, I'm going to tell you about a man who should have died a dozen times, but refused. His name was Hugh Glass. He was mauled by a grizzly. Abandoned by his own men. Left with nothing but a broken leg, an open throat, and 200 miles of wilderness between him and the nearest settlement. This is not a story about revenge. This is a story about what happens when a man decides he's not done living. In 1823, a grizzly bear tore a man's throat open, crushed his ribs, and left him with his spine exposed to the air. His companions buried him in a shallow grave and walked away. No food. No weapon. No chance. But they made one mistake. He was still breathing. To understand what happened to Hugh Glass, you have to understand the world he came from. America in the early 1800s was not a country, it was an idea, with a thin ribbon of settlement clinging to the eastern seaboard. Beyond the Mississippi, there was no law. No roads. No maps. There were only men. Hugh Glass was born around 1783, the same year the United States won its independence. He grew up in Pennsylvania, the son of Scotch-Irish immigrants. But by the time he was 30, he had lived more lives than most men could imagine. He was captured by pirates, the infamous Jean Lafitte, off the coast of Texas. Forced to sail and raid alongside the Gulf's most feared buccaneers. He escaped by jumping overboard and swimming through shark-infested waters to the shore. He was captured by the Pawnee, and instead of dying, he lived with them for years. He learned their language. Their tracking methods. Their way of moving silently through hostile land. By 1821, Hugh Glass walked into St. Louis with a delegation of Pawnee chiefs. He was 40 years old. He looked 70. He had been a pirate, a captive, a hunter, a survivor. And he was broke. So when General William Henry Ashley placed an advertisement in the Missouri Gazette, to all enterprising young men, ascend the Missouri River to its source, there to be employed for 2 or 3 years, Hugh Glass answered. Ashley's call brought together one of the most remarkable groups of men in American history. Jedediah Smith, a young man with a Bible and a will of iron. Jim Bridger, barely a teenager, illiterate, who would become the greatest mountain man who ever lived. John Fitzgerald, a skilled, hardened woodsman with a short temper. Edward Rose, James Beckworth, the Sublette brothers. History would call them Ashley's 100. They were the first generation of American mountain men, the ones who opened the West before the government even knew what was there. In the spring of 1823, Ashley led his men up the Missouri into Sioux and Arikara territory. The plan was simple: trade for furs, establish forts, map the unmapped. But the Arikara, the Rees, had a different plan. On June 2, 1823, Ashley's expedition made camp near the Arikara villages on the Missouri. The Rees had traded with them that very day. Everything seemed peaceful. But the Arikara had been raided by white trappers before. They trusted no one. Just before dawn, in the dead hour of night, they came. 12 men died in the first minutes. Hugh Glass took a bullet in the leg. Beside him, a young man named John S. Gardner was hit. Glass dragged him to cover, but the wound was fatal. Before he died, Gardner asked Glass to write a letter to his father. Glass kept that promise. The letter still exists, a piece of paper stained with smoke and blood. In it, Glass wrote, "The savages are greatly treacherous. We traded with them as friends, but after a great storm of rain and thunder, they came at us before light and many were hurt." He added, "I myself was shot in the leg." Ashley's expedition was shattered. They retreated downriver, regrouped, and decided to split the remaining men into 2 groups. One would go overland under Jedediah Smith. The other, the group Hugh Glass joined, would push northwest to Fort Henry under Andrew Henry. The Missouri was closed. They would go by land. Andrew Henry's party had 17 men. They moved northwest through what is now South Dakota, following the Grand River. The country was beautiful, golden prairie, cottonwood groves, clear water. But it was Sioux land, and the Sioux had not been consulted. Glass, at 48, was the oldest man in the party. He was the hunter, ranging ahead of the main group, watching for game, feeding the column. On or around August 23, 1823, the exact date is lost to history, Glass was working his way through brush along the riverbank. He was looking for deer sign. He had no idea that something else was looking for him. Behind a thicket of wild plum bushes, a sow grizzly with 2 cubs had made her bed. And Hugh Glass was about to step into it. Glass was the hunter. He was good at his job, that's why he was ahead of the column, alone. He didn't know the grizzly was there. But she knew he was coming. And she had 2 cubs to protect. The grizzly bear of the Great Plains in 1823 was not the grizzly of today. These animals were larger, more aggressive, and unafraid of men. They had never been hunted with rifles. They had no reason to fear. This one was a mother, 800 pounds of muscle, fur, and maternal fury. Her cubs were nearby. And Hugh Glass was between her and them. She exploded from the brush without warning. Accounts from the men who found him describe the scene with grim precision. The bear had torn the flesh from the lower part of his body. His neck was laid open to the windpipe, witnesses said they could see his breath escaping through the side of his throat. His ribs were exposed. His leg was broken. The scalp was partially detached. He was still alive. The men shot the bear off him. It took several rounds to bring the animal down. When they rolled the carcass aside, they found Glass in a condition that no one thought survivable. Hiram Allen, one of the trappers, later wrote, "The monster had torn the flesh from the lower part of the body and from the lower limbs. His neck was shockingly torn, even to the degree that an aperture appeared to have been made into the windpipe, and his breath to exude at the side of his neck. They expected him to die within minutes. But Hugh Glass did not die. He lay there, breathing through a hole in his throat, while the men debated what to do. Andrew Henry, the expedition leader, made a decision. They would carry him. For 2 days, they carried him across the prairie on a litter made of tree boughs. Every step sent agony through his shattered body. He never screamed. He never asked them to stop. On the 3rd day, Henry made another decision. The party was moving too slowly. They were weeks from Fort Henry. Blackfoot territory lay ahead. If they kept carrying Glass, they would all die. Henry called for volunteers to stay with Glass until the end. 2 men stepped forward, John Fitzgerald, a hardened frontiersman in his 30s, and James Bridger, a teenager barely old enough to grow a beard. Henry offered them $80, a small fortune, to remain with Glass until he died, give him a Christian burial, then catch up. Fitzgerald and Bridger stayed with Glass for 5 days. They waited for him to die. He refused. On the 6th day, Fitzgerald made a decision. Fitzgerald convinced young Bridger that Glass was beyond help, that staying any longer would get them both killed by the Sioux or the Blackfoot. The old man was as good as dead anyway. Why let his equipment rot in the ground with him? They took his rifle, his knife, his tomahawk, his fire-starting kit. "A dead man has no need of these," Fitzgerald said. They left him beside a spring, wrapped in his own blanket, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a wound that should have killed him 3 times over. They did not bury him. They simply walked away. When Fitzgerald and Bridger reached Fort Henry, they reported Glass dead. No one questioned it. No one mourned. But Hugh Glass was not dead. He was not even unconscious. He had heard everything. He had felt his rifle being taken from his hands. He had watched the men who were supposed to bury him walk away. And in that moment, something happened that no biologist can fully explain. His body decided to live. The first thing he did was reset his own leg. He grabbed the broken bone, set it as best he could, and bound it with strips torn from his blanket. Then he looked at his wounds. They were already infested with maggots. Any other man would have tried to clean them. Glass understood what the maggots were doing. They were eating the dead flesh, preventing gangrene. He left them alone. He was 200 miles from the nearest settlement. He had no food. No water. No weapon. He could barely crawl. And across 2 states of hostile wilderness, outlaws and war parties were looking for men exactly like him. He started moving anyway. Fitzgerald took his rifle. His knife. His fire-starting kit. "A dead man has no need of these," Fitzgerald said. But Glass wasn't dead. And now he had nothing, except 200 miles of prairie, a broken leg, and a reason to live. Which, as it turns out, was enough. Historians still debate the route Hugh Glass took. The most likely path follows the Grand River toward the Missouri, then south toward Fort Kiowa, a trading post near the mouth of the White River. It is roughly 200 miles of open prairie, badland, and river bottom. He crawled the first several miles on his hands and knees. Then, as his leg began to heal, he moved to a hunched shuffle, something between a walk and a fall. He ate berries. He ate roots. He ate insects. He ate snakes that he caught with his bare hands. Anything with calories was food. On the 7th or 8th day, he had lost count, he heard wolves. He dragged himself toward the sound and found a pack of gray wolves taking down a buffalo calf. Glass did not care about the danger. He crawled straight into the middle of the kill, roaring like an animal, waving his arms. The wolves backed off. He ate the calf raw. Then he stayed there for days, eating what he could, regaining his strength. A passing band of Lakota Sioux found him there. They could have killed him. Instead, they fed him. They gave him a hide boat and pointed him toward Fort Kiowa on the Missouri. The Missouri River in 1823 was the highway of the plains. It was also the most dangerous waterway in North America, choked with sandbars, shifting channels, and war parties on both banks. Glass floated downstream in his bull-hide boat, day after day, drifting past abandoned Arikara villages, past Sioux hunting camps, past the carcasses of buffalo killed by hunters who had passed this way weeks before. Mid-October 1823. 6 weeks after the Grizzly attack. Hugh Glass, a man who was supposed to be dead, walked into Fort Kiowa on his own 2 feet. The men at the fort did not believe who he was. They thought he was a ghost. He was 30 pounds lighter. His face was a mask of scars. His clothes were rags. But he was alive. And he had one question. Where can I find John Fitzgerald and James Bridger? At Fort Kiowa, Glass learned that a trading party was heading upriver to the Mandan villages, 300 miles north, toward Fort Henry, where Fitzgerald and Bridger were waiting. He joined as the 6th man. The leader of the party was a man named Antoine Citalo, called Langevin by the men. They loaded a Mackinaw boat with trade goods and pushed off in late October. 6 weeks against the current. Battling winds, cold rain, and the growing certainty that the Arikara were watching from the shore. They made it within 1 day of the Mandan villages. Glass, impatient, asked to be put ashore. He would walk the rest of the way, faster alone. It was the second time the Arikara had almost killed him. The first time was the ambush in June. The third time was coming. The Arikara women saw Glass before he saw them. They ran to their village, screaming about a white man, a ghost man, scarred and bearded, crawling out of the wilderness. Warriors mounted their horses. Glass saw the dust and knew he was dead. But the Mandan, ancient enemies of the Arikara, also saw what was happening. 2 Mandan riders reached Glass first, scooped him onto a horse, and raced him to a Columbia Fur Company trading post called Tilton's Post. At Tilton's Post, Glass received news that shattered him. The trading party he had left, Langevin's party, had been attacked by the Arikara the day after he departed. Every single man was dead. All 5 of them. The Arikara had spared exactly one man. The one who wasn't there. Glass had survived 3 Indian attacks in 6 months. 21 men had died around him. And Hugh Glass was still standing. He asked for a rifle. He was going to Fort Henry. Glass walked for 38 days from Tilton's Post to the Yellowstone River. Lonely miles through frozen prairie, crossing rivers swollen with ice, sleeping in the open with no fire, because fire would attract the Arikara. When he reached Fort Henry, it was empty. The fort had been abandoned. He found a note, or what historians believe was a note, telling him that Henry's men had moved to a new fort on the Bighorn River, 30 miles south. New Year's Eve, 1823. Hugh Glass walked through the gates of the new Fort Henry. The men inside were gathered for a meal. They looked up and saw a dead man standing in the doorway. The kitchen fell silent. Glass had survived the Grizzly, the prairie, the river, the Arikara. 3 times. But the hardest part wasn't surviving. It was what came after. He walked into Fort Henry on New Year's Eve, a dead man, standing in the doorway. The boy who had left him was on the other side of that room. And now we find out what Hugh Glass was really made of. The historian Hiram Chittenden described the scene. There was a sudden silence. Every man in the room recognized him, and every man felt as if he had seen a ghost. Andrew Henry himself approached Glass. He did not apologize for leaving him. He did not ask how he survived. He simply asked what he needed. Glass asked 2 questions: where is John Fitzgerald? And where is James Bridger? Fitzgerald had already left the fort and enlisted in the U.S. Army at Fort Atkinson. But Bridger was still there. 19 years old. The boy who had taken his rifle and left him to die. Every man in the room expected blood. Glass walked up to the boy. Bridger did not raise his eyes. He was certain he was about to die. What Hugh Glass did next is the reason his story has survived for 2 centuries. It is not the bear attack. It is not the 200-mile crawl. It is this moment. He looked at James Bridger, the boy who had abandoned him, who had taken his rifle, who had left him to rot beside a spring with a broken neck and open ribs, and he forgave him. Glass had crawled 200 miles through hell. He had survived a grizzly, 3 Indian attacks, starvation, and a winter alone. He had done it all with one thought burning in his mind: revenge. And when he finally stood face to face with the men who had betrayed him, he found that revenge was not what he wanted. He wanted his rifle back. Fitzgerald had taken it. And Fitzgerald was now a soldier. In June 1824, after another winter in the wilderness, another Arikara attack in which 2 more men died beside him, and another impossible survival, Glass walked into Fort Atkinson, Nebraska, and demanded to see the man who had stolen his rifle. The captain on duty listened to Glass's story. He did not laugh. He did not dismiss it. He believed him. The captain summoned John Fitzgerald. He ordered him to return Glass's rifle and pay him compensation, $300 by some accounts. Then the captain gave Glass a choice: he could kill Fitzgerald right there and be hanged for murder, or he could take his rifle, take the money, and walk away. Glass looked at the man who had left him to die. Fitzgerald said nothing. Glass took his rifle. And he walked out. Outside the fort, Glass told a friend that he had warned Fitzgerald, "If you ever leave the army, I will still kill you." But he never did. He never pursued Fitzgerald again. He moved on. Hugh Glass lived 10 more years. He trapped beaver. He hunted buffalo. He signed on with a fur company bound for Santa Fe. He became a legend while he was still alive, a story that other mountain men told around campfires. He never married. He never settled down. The wilderness was his home. In the early spring of 1833, Glass was trapping along the Yellowstone River in present-day North Dakota. He was traveling with 2 other men, Edward Rose, a former pirate like himself, and Highland Menard. They were ambushed by the Iroquois. There were no survivors. The Iroquois had finally collected the debt Hugh Glass had owed them for a decade. He was approximately 50 years old. Nobody found his body. His grave is the entire American West.